Welcome to the 352nd of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I talk about mass death as everyday life in the pandemic with legal historian Mary DUDZIAK. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID calls live on weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID calls YouTube channel to watch. You can hear COVID calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, October 4th, 2021, there are 4,801,304 deaths from COVID-19 globally. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. Headline is Colin Jones Obituary. This appeared in The Guardian on October 1st, 2021. It was written by Peter Crookston. One line that always produced a laugh from audiences watching the film Billy Elliot was, "What's best, to be a ballet dancer or to be a miner?" The photographer Colin Jones, who's died aged 85 from COVID-19, would not have thought this such a funny question. He had worked in one of those worlds as a dancer, touring with the Royal Ballet, and had documented the other with superb photographs published in The Observer and the Independent magazines and in a book entitled Grafters, which appeared in 2002. He also did important work for the Sunday Times, in particular the Black House Project in the 1970s, leading one critic there to describe him as the George Orwell of British photojournalism. Colin became fascinated by the working lives of miners on his first assignment for The Observer after leaving the Royal Ballet in 1962. He was sent to cover some early pit closures in the Northeast and later told an interviewer, "It may sound strange, but I found so many similarities between the lives of miners and ballet dancers. There was the same dependence on strength, fitness, and endurance, the same comradeship of a tight-knit community doing a job, and when they finish work, they're both physically exhausted and drenched in sweat, though miners are covered in coal dust and their work is full of dangers." On a tour to Australia and New Zealand with the Royal Ballet in 1958, Colin bought his first camera, a Ricoflex, while on an errand in Sydney for Margot Fontaine. He immediately began taking photographs of the company's dancers, exercising at the bar and working in rehearsals. In 1961, he met Lynn Seymour, the star of the touring company, and she accompanied Colin on some of his shooting expeditions when on tour into places such as Manila and the side streets of Tokyo. The greatest influence on Colin's photography was The Observer's arts photographer Michael Pito, whom he met backstage at the Royal Opera House in the 1960s during the golden era of Fontaine, Rudolf Nureyev, Seymour, and Christopher Gable. Pito was a Hungarian immigrant whose work Colin had always admired. Michael didn't take pictures in the way that the rest did. He could see the ballet for what it was, a lot of hard work. Many of his pictures were of exhausted dancers after the endless tedium of rehearsals in dusty church halls. Pito introduced Colin to the Observer's picture editor, Dennis Hackett. The Northeast assignment resulted in Colin's first big picture spread, astonishing images of men and women scrabbling for coal on a colliery waste tip near Sunderland and taking it home in sacks on the crossbars of old bicycles. Born in Poplar, East London, Colin was the son of a printer, George Jones, and his wife, Maud. For most of his early years, his father was away in the army, serving in the Burma campaign. With his mother and his older brother, Colin was evacuated to Essex. He was evacuated twice more, attending 13 schools while struggling with dyslexia. When he left school at 15, he had no qualifications, but after hearing a career advisor encouraging leavers to consider becoming dancers, he enrolled at a dancing school in the front room of a semi in New Eltham, Kent. His most successful work, begun in 1973, was the documentation of a group of mostly young Black men who lived in a dilapidated terraced house in Islington, North London, known as the Harambee Project. Harambee is Swahili for pulling together. They were the children of the first generation of Caribbean immigrants who had been brought over to join their parents and had become alienated by the prejudice they experienced. Most were unemployed and some had criminal convictions. With his gentle and beguiling manner, he was able to persuade the young men to let him photograph them. Their patience was rewarded with a magazine cover story, On the Edge of the Ghetto. The pictures were exhibited at the Photographers Gallery in 1977 and in 2006 published as a book, The Black House. The accolade he valued above all others was a letter framed on his darkroom wall from the acclaimed photographer Bill Brandt about his 1960s portraits of gunslinging characters in a feud between rival scrap metal merchants in Fulham. Dear Colin Jones, I feel I must tell you how delighted I am with your feature in yesterday's Sunday Times. I think they are the strongest photographs I have seen for a long time. Congratulations and best wishes. The obituary of Colin Jones, photographer and ballet dancer who died at age 85 from COVID-19. Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today, and let me introduce my guest. Mary DUDZIAK is the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Law at Emory University. Her most recent book is Wartime, An Idea, Its History, Its Consequences, which appeared with Oxford University Press. Her current book project argues that the culture of war death in the United States helps explain the decline of political restraints on the war powers. During the COVID era, she has been obsessing over the way a mass death experience has essentially been normalized. Mary DUDZIAK, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I'd like to start the way I generally do, find out where you're calling from and what the pandemic situation looks like there.
Yeah, so I'm calling in from Atlanta, Georgia. And Georgia is, if you happen to obsess over the data like I do, and you look at the maps on the New York Times COVID page, Georgia is in the death zone, right? Those states in the South that have been experiencing more deaths, COVID deaths, than other parts of the country. I know that Alaska is currently an area of crisis, but right now I checked the data, and Georgia is 6th in the nation in deaths over the past 7 days, 6th in hospitalizations. I think this is per capita. Actually, I'm not sure if it's per capita or absolute numbers. It must be absolute numbers. But ICUs had been full, but they are now better, but they're still over 90% capacity. That means that, if you get hit by a car, you may or may not be able to be treated at a hospital. So Georgia is in an area of great danger.
And in terms of the vaccination rate, I mean, this point, I guess we're pretty comfortable saying there's a causal relationship between where you find yourself and what the vaccination rate is there.
Absolutely. Not only the vaccination rate, but our governor, Brian Kemp, in his wisdom he said it's a good idea to wear a mask, but he will not mandate masks, and he doesn't want local governments to mandate masks. And so I teach at Emory, which is a private university, but at public universities in Georgia, professors can't require students to wear masks in their classroom. So this has led to real crises at Georgia public institutions with some faculty members quitting because they, why should they, risk their lives when students won't even wear masks in the classroom?
I remember one story, and I don't want to get the details wrong here, but I think he was a professor, an adjunct professor who was teaching at one of the Georgia public universities, and is a veteran. And in mid-class, the way the story said, he said, "You know what? If you're not going to wear the mask, I'm out." And that was it for him.
Right. He had been called in to teach. I read the same story. Called in to teach, cover a class that was a requirement, and so he's basically helping out. And sure enough, the students wouldn't. Some of the students wouldn't wear masks, and of course, he would have been at great risk because of his age if he got COVID.
I've been asking people if they wouldn't mind sharing a memory that sort of encapsulates this time. And I know it's hard to maybe choose one moment in the pandemic, but I'd like to put the same question to you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, for me, and I think it sort of explains in some ways, the dark tone of my at least initial writing, that the pandemic sort of coincided with regular everyday family tragedies. And so it was this confluence that just led to this really dark time in my family. We lost a nephew, sudden and unexpected, shocking death in the fall of 2019. Then we would remember him in the spring, right? Also in the spring, my mother-in-law had been living in a nursing home, and then began to decline. And so my husband just happened to be in Rhode Island, where she lived, in April, and saw her the day before they shut down all the nursing homes. And Rhode Island was one of the states, along with the state of Washington, that really had crisis numbers at the beginning. And so my mother-in-law was dying. The nursing home was shut down. Her husband, he's now 96 years old, living still in their home, wasn't able to see her every day as he had. And so her death and the experience of that was just heavily affected by the growing crisis of the pandemic and the real difficulty that nursing homes had scrambling around trying to figure out how to control it. And so, that really sort of colored the beginning of the pandemic for me. And that actually led my husband and I to decide to spend a lot of the first year of the pandemic actually in Rhode Island, so that we could, my husband wouldn't be able to fly up to see his dad, which is what he would have planned to do after Elizabeth, my mother-in-law, passed away. So we found a house, right on the coast, and we tried to keep my father-in-law out of Burger King. So we would make him breakfast every morning, the sort of our version of an Egg McMuffin, only it had avocados on it and farm fresh bacon. And I would make it, and my husband would drive it over and sit outside, even though it was winter, and have breakfast with my father-in-law. So we ended up having really this very interesting and lovely time in Rhode Island, just trying to keep my father-in-law alive, which we succeeded. Well, he succeeded at staying alive, and really it was life affirming for all of us.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I'm sorry for the tragedies your family faced, and the way you told it, God, I hope you'll write that. I mean, the way you told it, to go from that, but then your job was to keep your father-in-law out of Burger King. It's tremendous. And there's
Literally.
so much, yeah, no, but I get it. I mean, there's so much intergenerational care and scolding and anything that could be done, particularly at those days when the nursing homes and the elder care facilities were failing. I don't think there's any other way to put it.
That's
You
right.
had to do that.
Yep.
I know there's another question that I particularly wanted to ask you. I've asked a few guests about numbers, and we're going to talk a lot about numbers today, but those, from the flattening the curve, and so people habituating themselves to graphics, and then the death numbers, maybe now the vaccination numbers, although I don't see the same fascination with those. We have become numerically competent, I guess you could say, or we've talked about numbers a lot in the pandemic, but I often worry about the numbers, the ones we're talking about, and I know you do as well. But I wonder what kind of numbers you pay the most attention to now.
Well, I mean, mostly I think about the limitations of numbers, right? And the need, as you do, I have to say, Scott, I so appreciate not just this program, but the way that you begin with the story of someone who has died. Because I think the numbers, focus on the numbers, cause us to lose track of the human dimension of the catastrophe. But I still, though, I'm not sort of as much of a doom scroller as I was, through the beginning of the pandemic. But I do. I actually still pay attention to the numbers I paid attention to from the beginning. I try to find what are the most accurate numbers for the infection rate where I am, the infection rate where people I care about are. And vaccination rates do matter, but they're so politicized that, and really all of the numbers, you sort of wish they would have more of a motivating impact. I was interested in, the display, which I would have loved to have gone to in Washington, D.C., of all the little flags, this artistic display, one for every death. And as if that could help us. So these exercises to try to help people understand how massive and devastating this pandemic has been. So to me, the fact that mass death experience has become just an everyday event, that we have sort of normalized it and incorporated it into our everyday experience. And then in places like Georgia, we're really encouraged to go on as if it wasn't still continuing, so that people who are being more protective kind of feel like aliens, actually. So there are these developing divisions in social life that may persist beyond the pandemic. So yeah, that's part of what I think about numbers.
I think those are themes we'll probably talk about all those for the rest of our discussion today. I want to remind people you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to legal historian Mary DUDZIAK. And Mary, I want to go back a little bit and talk about your 2012 book, Wartime, and maybe talk a little bit about the project and why you wanted to work on putting time itself in historical context, particularly the sort of special place that historically Americans have carved out for something which they call wartime, because it really takes a close look at how, of course, how time is political, but also how time gets distorted and how sort of culturally we make particular times for things, which, I mean, as a historian reading this kind of thing, of course, is very affirming to me that we're on the right track to not treat time as a linearity and just say things happen on a line going from here to here, but you really explored that. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Yeah, the reason that I did that book, it started with an essay, and then Marilyn, my dear friend, the late Marilyn Young, ordered me to turn it into a book. And who's gonna?
That's the best. Just taking orders to write the book. That's the way. Yeah.
But really, I sort of wrote that book by mistake, because I was supposed to be writing the big book that I'm writing now, which is really about, the sort of decline of democratic engagement with American war politics, which I think is sort of at the core of enabling the forever war. But I just had to get my head around the problem of time. And time has a special importance in legal history, actually, and in how we think about law. because the traditional idea is there's two kinds of time, there's wartime and peacetime, and history consists of moving from one kind of time to another. And law is different in wartime and peacetime. So the saying is, in times of war, law is silent. And the idea is that there's a swinging pendulum. During wartime, security is prioritized, rights are deprioritized, but don't worry, because we'll switch from wartime to peacetime, and then the pendulum will swing back. And once we ended up in the war on terror, of course, the same rhetoric appears that, this is a wartime, so of course we're going to have that pendulum swing, but with this conceptualization, the pendulum would inevitably swing back. But of course, wars aren't bound in time, and security regimes don't recess. Instead, practices and laws sort of get built in, get repurposed in the aftermath of a conflict, and so often what we expect is going to go away instead becomes embedded. So I just sort of really went to the literature on time, which is spectacular, and sort of wrote about the way that wartime is a cultural idea. It's not something about the nature of time or the nature of war. It's a set of ideas that we want to believe or don't, and that don't necessarily coincide with social practices.
But your impetus to write that book was to try to approach this problem of forever war, which if I'm right, I mean, you take that to, I mean, that could go back pretty far if you wanted to, but it was motivated by September 11 and the changes to the Homeland Security state after September 11, or do you reach further back than that?
Oh, further back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, the classic argument about the decline in democratic restraints on war is that we ended the draft, and so therefore the American people aren't engaged with war. And the draft and the end of the draft was tremendously important, but I will argue in the next book, if I ever finish it, that actually builds onto a pre-existing phenomenon. And should I sort of explain that?
Sure, I'd love to hear more about it.
When I sat down to actually now let me write the big book, I then said to myself, well, war is about killing and death, and how does death figure in the narrative? Death is a quintessential experience in war. War accomplishes a purpose through the use of violence and killing. So how does death figure in the narrative? And so one thing led to another, and a confluence of Thomas Laqueur on the work of the dead. I had a chance to have coffee with him right before the book. It was just as he was finishing the book and sending it off to the printer. And Jugelben Faust, who I've never met, but whose book on death and the Civil War I also became obsessed with. And so the two of them essentially required me to rethink the whole narrative of the book, so that I begin actually with the Civil War, which I never expected to write about, because that's the experience that the United States lost. Luckily, we lost it when war moved offshore. So basically, all of American war after the Civil War and wars with Native American tribes, all of American war was foreign war. And that meant that US civilians did not experience the carnage of war. So the experience, I sort of narrate, as other people do, the civilian experience ad Antietam. And that's the experience that in World War II, American civilians did not have, for example. So this sort of losing, and Ernie Pyle writes about it. Mm-hmm. That in his last column, essentially railing against the public for not seeing the dead scattered across the hillsides that you cannot understand because you didn't see it. And so that absence of connection, direct connection with the experience of killing and dying and being vulnerable to death, that has affected American war politics. And I see it changing over time. It's not flat. And so, yes, it's different in World War I than it is in World War II. But that's a sort of a dynamic that I think drives the narrative of the loss of political engagement with American war.
Thank you so much for going into that in detail. And the book is Wartime, which is Mary DUDZIAK's 2012 book, and everybody should grab that book and look. And you talked about Drew Gilpin Faust's book, This Republic of Suffering, and that one, and this whole collection of books, yours included, that you're talking about here. It has made me more emboldened, I guess, to talk about disaster and time, because I think there's a similar dynamic at work. It's more contemporary because we have more of the state focused on disaster management now than we did, let's say, that wouldn't have been the right terminology in the 19th century. But this idea that there's special time for a disaster and then there's special time in which we're not experiencing disaster, and to actually try to understand what that means to make that claim, both as an administrative, as a legal matter, but also as a cultural matter. And I think they're very similar. Maybe it is the same project ultimately in the end.
Well, it's interesting. So I think that, on the one hand, I mean, COVID, I think people will talk about it in temporal terms, right? That there is this time within which the COVID pandemic happened, just as the 1819 flu. And on some level, that will be correct, right? There will be the onset of COVID-19, and hopefully someday it at least kind of subsides into some manageable public health dimension. But then one question is, what ends up counting as a crisis that then calls upon the state for the level of mobilization to meet a crisis, and has the sort of politically mobilizing dimension, right? So those are two things that can come out of a crisis for war or for pandemic, that the state's mobilized to deal with it, and that the public is sort of mobilized to engage with it. I mean, the engagement is splintered now because of the Trump administration and the aftermath. But this idea that certain huge social problems fall within the category of crisis that requires this mobilization leaves aside things like the Flint water crisis and the poisoning of children in American cities with lead, and other kinds of ongoing crises that affect certain populations. So I think that before we kind of turn COVID-19 into a magic and special moment in history that's held aside for the kind of mobilization that we wish we would see here, I think we also have to ask ourselves why this is special and why certain other incredibly deadly and destructive crises, again, like the Flint water crisis, don't reach the same level of public attention and mobilization. And sort of Flint as an example of the poisoning of other children in other cities by lead. It tends to be, in communities of the poor.
That question is such an important one to me. And I wanted to ask you about that because war metaphors have been employed throughout the pandemic, and particularly early on. This was the language that the news media and elected officials and scholars too reached for. And I had very mixed feelings about that. I'm sort of curious how you felt about that too, because I felt like we have a lot of metaphors also to talk about care, And so a pandemic doesn't have to be a war, but the reason for my mixed feeling is that I do know what the powers of war can unleash for the state. Again, we're in a bit of a bind. We've created these special powers, war powers, that do emphasize speed and reach of the government and executive action. And so I guess I wonder how you felt in that moment. And for me, it was an assumption, okay, well, I may not like it that they call the pandemic a war, but at least we're going to see a vigorous response. And then nothing, or not
Right.
as much as I wanted.
I think that it's interesting and really highly ironic and problematic that war is the special thing, right? War is the special thing that, by definition, calls for strong government response, including sometimes oppressive government policies. And isn't it interesting that a country that only goes to war in other places of the world would think of war as this special thing that calls forth especially important government powers. So again, we have this sort of long experience of the U.S. using its war power elsewhere, and I think that enables Americans who are generally are privileged to be, unless they're serving in the military, right, are privileged to be incredibly ignorant about what the experience of war is actually like. So I think that for me, I mean, so it's a different kind of problem with the invocation of war, but that to me is just it reinforces the fact that Americans can have certain feelings about U.S. war that derive from the fact that they don't have to suffer from it.
Mm. I mean, that's such a remarkable statement. And again, I guess we'd be searching for that time in which you would say Americans made a shift from when something you would call wartime meant a much broader sacrifice of resources and of kin. And we make that move into a different sort of reality. And maybe it must be before September 11th. I don't know when you would. I should ask you when you would put that that transition on the board. But it's as you describe it, I see this more clearly now. I mean, I will thank you for that, because we're reaching for a war metaphor at the beginning of the pandemic. We're talking about something that the great majority of people in the United States have not experienced and don't have family members who are even in the line of fire. So why would we reach for that?
Right. And I think of Jim Sparrow's great book, Warfare State. I mean, even though most Americans were isolated from the experience of killing and dying in World War II, right? But I mean, my father actually got drafted into World War II, but then drafted into the Manhattan Project. That's another story.
Mm.
But Jim Sparrow's book sort of shows the way there was such deep engagement with the American state, right, so that there was this broad and deep mobilization, and in many ways that acculturated Americans, whether it was just the need to follow. Well, I write in the wartime book Daylight Savings Time, which was a war measure. It was a reminder that they were essentially serving their country at war. So World War II, because of the deep domestic mobilization, the need to really turn out the material in the factories, that led to much greater American experience with the project of war than, for example, the Korean War.
One more thing about this I wanted to touch on before I ask you about some of your more recent writings about this pandemic, and that's the role of September 11 in this. And again, people will have to cast their memory back to those earlier days, the pandemic in the United States. And I think it happened in other parts of the world, but it particularly happened in the United States, where people were reaching for death count metaphors to try to grasp the enormity of the problem. And September 11 was one that I think people reach to because it's recent, it's shared pretty broadly culturally, and it sort of conjured, I think, for a lot of people, if they can dissociate it from the Iraq War, it conjured a moment of some kind of American solidarity. I don't want to overstate that because many Americans, particularly Muslim Americans, did not feel that. But I do think it was there and it was vital. I wonder how you saw that sort of invocation of September 11 in that moment early in the pandemic.
Yeah, well, sort of two things. Let me sort of say a word about September 11th. For many Americans, the replay over and over again of the buildings falling. And so I remember myself seeing the first tower fall live on CNN when I was in California, and just thinking about what the numbers must be, right? And how many people lost their lives in those minutes. Now, the people who died in the World Trade Center buildings were not only Americans. There were people from, I forget the number, but many different countries who lost their lives. And so September 11th was in many ways a global event, and it generated not just some level of solidarity, at least for a moment, in the United States, but also around the world. Again, this didn't last very long, but people, right in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, people took flowers and candles to U.S. embassies around the world, and American flags in Germany and in Middle Eastern countries, in Asia, all over the world, and cried. And so there was, again, there were differences, obviously, but there was this outpouring of global support and solidarity and sadness. Now, this could have been mobilizing, right? This could have been a moment when the world came together to crack down on terrorism, to think seriously about our common interest in aviation security, right? But instead, there was the turn to war. So it wasn't that war was automatically determined by the buildings falling. War was a choice, and then once Bush, took the microphone at Ground Zero, to me that was the moment. And what happened was the country rallied behind a president who had not before had all of the country behind him because of the disputed 2000 election, right? At that moment, he became the country's president. Everyone was scared, and everyone rallied, not everyone, but much of the country rallied behind him. And so there was a choice to turn it into a war metaphor. And the cost of that, especially with the run-up with the Iraq War, was this moment of global sympathy and solidarity that could have been used for something that was positive.
Just a reminder, you're listening to COVID Calls, and I'm talking today to legal historian Mary DUDZIAK about mass death and everyday life as part of the pandemic. Mary, I want to come to something that you wrote last summer, and it's a piece titled "The Numbers: Encountering Casualties in the Era of COVID-19." You can find this in the journal Diplomatic History. It appeared June 30th of this year. Sorry, I thought it was last time. It was this summer. It's a great piece. Everyone should read this piece. And you start it in a way that really appealed to me for reasons you mentioned a moment ago. You talk about encountering an obituary of Cosmas Magaya. How did Cosmas Magaya enter your consciousness?
Well, this was, I told you at the beginning of the discussion about how this was really a dark period in my own family. And so I was actually up in Rhode Island in July when I started it. I was asked to write by the editors of Diplomatic History, Petra Gude and Ann Foster, had this brilliant idea of asking a bunch of people to write about how the pandemic affected their work. And so there's this extraordinary group of essays, and my gift to you all is that I used my research funds to make it open access, so there's no paywall. So I was thinking, what do I have to say? I can't write anything. And then I woke up one morning, I'm really pretty much in the middle of the night, and I'd been thinking about this obituary, which I found just through my regular doom scrolling. And it was written by, and that allowed me to write. And so Paul Berliner is an ethnomusicologist. I think he taught at the University of Chicago. And he wrote this beautiful remembrance of Cosmas Magaya, who was a mbira master. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It's a kind of instrument that is used in his home country, Zimbabwe. And he was a global, presence among people who use those instruments. And he had done he'd gotten to know Paul Berliner, and he had actually played a remembrance after 9/11. So he was someone who, through his music, had been profoundly healing. And I just found this obituary to be so moving. And so I started by writing about him. And that allowed me to write the essay. But to me, it was just, and it still is so tremendously important to pay attention to people, specific people who have lost their lives, or specific people whose lives have been tremendously changed. So many people are affected by long COVID symptoms, right? And so there's all sorts of impacts, and we're all going to be living with this aftermath, and we need to remember them, and we need to account for them. So that's what got me started writing. I actually sent my essay to Paul Berliner, and he sent it to Cosmas Magaya's family.
Well, I'm glad you did that.
Yeah.
And I hope they found some comfort in that. I don't know if you heard back anything.
No, I haven't. But actually, I haven't been in touch with Paul Berliner since it was in draft. So you're reminding me. So I'm going to send him the published version, and maybe I'll hear more.
And one of the things you really explore in the piece, which we were talking about earlier, related to some of your earlier work, is the problem of seeing the dead. So this, again, a sort of problem of connection with a mass death event. And you cast our memory back to, again, that period of time early in the pandemic, although now it's played out in multiple different places across the United States and around the world, but this was located particularly in New York, I think we think of it mostly, where the number of dead was moving faster than the metabolism of it was much faster than the crematoria or mortuaries could deal with. And so they were using mass graves. And you wrote, and at Hart Island particularly, there were mass graves, which the government was not keen for people, for maybe obvious reasons, to explore, to know about. But, photographs were taken and people did see them. I saw them. I know you saw them. You wrote about this. You said at Hart Island and elsewhere, so that's where the mass grave was, as in a slaughterhouse, unseen workers handle the death we don't see. Concealment in the pandemic, you wrote, may seem cultural, in keeping with cultural sensibilities about respect for the dead body, but the politics of sight is always enabled by power and interest. So it's a complicated idea, and one was hoping you could say a bit more there, because it's not only cultural in the sense that we want to maybe shield people, ourselves or other people, vulnerable people, maybe children, from the sight of death, but there's also a politics behind that. And I wonder if you could say more about it.
Right. Let me, I mean, I think there's more to say than I've thought through. So let me say something about it in relation to war and then circle back.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, imagine if we could walk among the remains of the mistaken drone strike in Afghanistan, right? During the withdrawal from Afghanistan, there was a drone strike, and basically what happened was they were following the wrong car, and civilians were killed, including a number of children. We can't see that. We can't smell it. It's not part of our neighborhood. Imagine how Americans might react to, I mean, basically, mistakes always happen in war. So it's not that it was a mistake. Mistakes always happen in war. But this experience of what war is something that's deeply foreign to American civilians. So that we only experience it by hearing numbers, like what political scientists do, many of them anyway, is they count numbers of American casualties in war, and they compare it with what happens in elections to determine what number of deaths Americans can bear before they start becoming more anti-war. Well, numbers are this abstraction, right? And even, you know, numbers don't capture what the experience of war is and how war affects a society and how war, you know, I mean, if you think, again, Ernie Pyle's writings, imagine if you could, you know, I think if we bring the senses to the experience, it's not just seeing, it's smelling, hearing, touching. Daniel Inouye, when he was a teenager on the island of Hawaii, was called in to help after the Pearl Harbor bombing, and sent into a school room, sent into a house that had been bombed, and said, try to put the pieces of one body, just one body, in each box. And he would have tasted it because he would have ingested the smoke. So the experience of war affects all of the senses, and you can't capture that in a number. So that the numbers provide this sanitized measure that is completely divorced from the experience. So I feel like I've sort of gotten far away from the point, but this is one of the reasons why looking to the tables of COVID figures, you know, it's shocking that just the abstraction of numbers has become normalized. So it's part of daily life. We look at the numbers and think, gee, should I go to the grocery store today with my mask on or not? But we don't have a purchase on the broader experience. Back to the issue, your sort of issue about controlling what we see. So even the sight of coffins was obscured when some guy sends up a drone to take pictures of Hart Island and gets arrested for the crime of sending up an aircraft outside of an airport, a very obscure crime that no one had ever heard before, right? But similarly, photographers who covered the Vietnam War said it was easier to shoot Vietnam than it is to shoot the pandemic because we can't see anything. And so we think of it as it's in part out of respect for the bodies, But the bodies at Hart Island, they aren't feeling this absence of sight, right? And they're also obscured and in coffins. But what's most profoundly protected is American social life, able to go on calmly, as usual. Let's not scare Americans out of the mall, for example, if we want to keep commerce going.
I just want to follow up on that, and I'm going to show an image here. And even my impulse to want to warn people about this before I put it up says something, but this is a very arresting image from an article published in the New York Times Magazine in the spring of 2020 by Maggie Jones, with extraordinary images by the photographer Philip Montgomery. And I'm just going to bring this up because I would like to get your sense of it. I think it very much speaks to what we've just been talking about. And this is an image. So the article is about a funeral home and the extraordinary lengths that this one family-owned funeral home went to deal with this surge, what came to be called the surge, another sort of military metaphor. And this image is one that I wanted, I guess in a sense, I wanted to just look at it and think about it again, because it really stopped me in my tracks when I first saw it. It was doing something that I don't, as you said, I mean, as social life just went on so people could get back to the mall, this stands in your way, I think. I wonder what if this is a type of image. I mean, I guess I have two questions for this. What sort of generally what you think about this kind of news coverage and this kind of photography, but also maybe this is speculative, but if we were to see more of this, or if this was more central to the culture of grappling with the COVID pandemic, do you think the policy outcomes would somehow have been different?
Well, this story was, and the photography was tremendously powerful. And this is basically the kind of photography that, these former war photographers said they couldn't get. And, when you're talking about live people in the hospital, of course, there are privacy, important privacy interests, but we're so far into the pandemic now. I thought, during that dark summer of 2020, this is what people needed to see. That we needed to have more coverage like this. We needed to stop hiding it. And we needed to talk about individual people. We needed to have family members on television more often, talking about what had happened to their family. And we needed to collectively mourn, right? Not just mourn, but mobilize. I mean, to me, the fact that we have such an incredibly, we're ground zero. The United States is ground zero for deaths in the world. And to have the American people accommodate this, right? Not be up in arms. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that happened, and we could talk about that separately. But I really thought, for the first few months at least, that we needed to see those pictures, and that would make a difference. Now, frankly, I'm not sure. I do think that having Trump as president helped determine much of the path of the sort of political and cultural reaction. It's possible that if we'd had a more compassionate conservative president, that things could have worked out profoundly differently, regardless of what party the president was from. But, we had this highly unusual, unstable, I don't want to use the words that are coming to me, but that had a tremendous impact on the culture of the pandemic in the United States, enabling, huge swaths of Americans to be in complete denial. So I think that if I was going to pick one causal factor, that would be it. I think historians will come up with a lot more nuanced and smart analysis over time. But really, I did think we needed those pictures. We needed more of them. And now I have no idea, once we got started this way, if anything could have changed the direction.
I just want to stay with this for a second because disinformation and conspiracy thinking, which is not new in American life, but is particularly effective throughout the pandemic in confusing people as to the nature of the pandemic and the truth of it. One of the things that we've heard throughout, that unfortunately I've even heard in discussions with family, is I don't believe the numbers. I think the numbers are inflated. I think, and then fill in the blank. Whatever malefactor is involved, this person wants me to change the way I'm living, and so they're taking this pandemic. It might be bad, but they're making it much worse than it is. And early on, we heard that in terms of, again, coming back to the numbers, this is just a bad flu season. When it's all done, the number of dead will be about the same as a bad flu season. So why are you making us close the schools and lock down and everything else? But we slipped past that very early on, and yet it persisted, that kind of disbelief and denial. And I mean, I study American history the same way you did, and frankly, I've been surprised. I wouldn't think I'd ever say I'd be surprised by anything in American capacity to deny reality, but this has taken me by surprise, frankly.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, what I think of as magical thinking among people who aren't sort of, going for the disinformation. And, people think, I'm healthy, I ride my bike, I'll be fine. I mean, my 96-year-old father-in-law was saying that. Retired Coast Guard captain, he's in pretty good shape for 96, but he's 96, right? So magical thinking, people just think they'll be okay. And I think that, especially among I shouldn't say especially among younger people, because I think it's not all age driven, people who go to concerts, people who want to go to the bars. And hey, I'm a recluse all the time. So, I know some folks can't abide that lifestyle and need to have much more social interaction. So I understand and respect that. I think that there are lots of reasons why people will take trips or engage in activities that, and some of them are just understandable. They needs to live human life in a way that allows them not to be depressed every morning.
So I wanted to just sort of come to one more thing on this. We're almost out of time in my COVID calls discussion with Mary DUDZIAK, but you mentioned earlier so I want to talk about memorials for a second. You mentioned earlier, and wish I could see it too, the memorial that was at the mall in Washington, D.C., the flags. And the curator of that exhibit announced, I think yesterday, that she's stopping. So it was there for a certain period of time, and it was there while that number went over 700,000. And all the photographs I saw they're staggering, because it's another way to apprehend the scale. It isn't just a number on a chart, but you actually see the physicality of it. And I think about that in terms of the Vietnam Memorial and the power of the numbers on the wall, or Arlington National Cemetery, both war memorials. And so reaching again for a war kind of memorial, the right Washington, D.C., a flag, not a patriotic gesture necessarily, but still a flag, and reaching for the power of that. And I think it worked, but at the same time, I wonder, and particularly in light of what you've written in our conversation today, if that's going to do the work that I want a memorial to get done, which is to have people actually stop and think about what needs to be learned from this pandemic and keep it from happening again. And to me, it comes back to maybe Cosmas Magara and the obituary, that a few well-chosen stories may be the kind of power, may have the kind of narrative power necessary to shake people a little bit and say, no, this really happened.
Yeah, I actually think we probably need both. I'm glad you mentioned Arlington because, you just go to Arlington National Cemetery and how can you not just be just overwhelmed by the death that's represented there. And so also if we could go and see the flags in Washington, D.C., we would be overwhelmed by those flags. But I think that because numbers are abstractions, and numbers don't really help us to see the real impacts, to have some purchase on the suffering is, I think, really important. So, again, that's why that story where you showed the picture was so tremendously helpful and important. And other individual stories like Paul Berliner's obituary of Cosmas Magaya, they help us to see the human toll of the virus, that every person isn't going to care about it. But for heaven's sakes, if we can't get a social movement to actually control this virus, could we at least have more people be moved and reflect on a regular basis about the precise individuals that we have all lost in this world, not just this country, from this virus. So I don't know what social change that might generate, but at least that might be a starting point of some kind of community that might be healing.
You've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can catch COVID Calls most weekdays live at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Please join me for the next COVID Calls. In fact, I will be behind the scenes. We're going to have a guest host on, it's going to be on Tuesday with Esther Chernak. I'm going to be on Wednesday with Esther Chernak, epidemiologist and physician at the Drexel University School of Medicine, and of course a frequent guest on COVID Calls. So please do join me, and I'll put up announcements for that. The next COVID Calls on Wednesday with Esther Chernak. And I want to thank my guest, Mary DUDZIAK, for this time and for your work. And please keep working because we need it, and for the illumination today and the discussion. Mary, thanks a million for this time.
I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who watched.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls.